Okay. Well, I realize, add another page here. If we take the book and we split it in half, well, first of all, we're at the halfway mark. And it seems to be the nature of this book, as it is with a lot of books, that it picks up speed as we go through. So we're halfway through material, but probably I'd say about 2/3 of the way through in terms of actual classes and whatnot. So if you break it into two parts, you have chapter 1 through chapter 6. Okay, chapter 1 through what? Is 1 through 4, and what are those? Dealing with division. Okay, then chapter 5 through 6, and that's dealing with immorality. Okay. I think it's very funny that I did it in a slightly different order, and it threw you all off. Chapter 7 through 16. Normally I do the top parts, and everybody froze when I did it differently. Chapter 7 is, it's dealing with marriage. And then chapter 8 through 10, which is what we're in, and that's dealing with meat sacrifice to idols. And then chapter 11 through, which deals with worship. And then chapter 15 is resurrection, yep. And then chapter 16 is conclusion. Okay. And so as we deal with this section, chapters 8 through 10, we're dealing with that meat sacrificed idols, and the central theme to the whole thing is conscience, the human conscience. And that's a very big deal, because your conscience is not always right. Right? There are plenty of people that are living their lives right now out in the world, and they have a clear conscience. Just totally pure, live happy. They don't have any problems. They think they're doing the right thing, and so they sleep well, no problems whatsoever. But they're wrong. Right? And so if I was never taught that, I don't know, I guess you could say just about anything. If I was never taught that taking the Lord's Supper was something I had to do to be a Christian, and so I went years without taking the Lord's Supper, I'd have a clear conscience, but I'd be sinning the whole time, right? And so your conscience isn't always right. So you have a guy who doesn't know he has to take the Lord's Supper, and he's got a clear conscience, but a wrong conscience. That conscience, that compass is off. It's not correct, but it's clear. And so you take that guy, and then you say, well, he's got a clear conscience, but he's wrong, so your conscience doesn't matter, right? See, my conscience doesn't matter. If my conscience can be wrong, don't pay any attention to your conscience, right? No. Now, see, I got a big problem, right? Because I have to pay attention to my conscience. Because even if my conscience is going to be wrong sometimes, and it will, if I don't pay attention to it, what kind of person am I going to become? So I'm going to become a real evil person very quickly if I don't pay attention to my conscience. Because in truth, most of your basic morals are built into you. The idea of not murdering and not stealing, and a lot of those basic morals are built into me. And the moment that I say, well, I'm not going to pay attention to my conscience, well, people who don't do that become psychopaths. Now, if you take all the serial killers that have ever lived, at one point they were taught and they had ingrained in their conscience, like everybody else, that murder is wrong, and then they just stopped paying attention to that. Well, what happens to somebody who just doesn't listen to that little voice in the back of their head? You're going to get yourself in a lot of trouble. And it's kind of like, I guess the way you'd put, people are raised by their parents, and most of us have the voice of our mom and dads in the back of our head somewhere, right? Well, were mom and dad always right? No, absolutely not. So since mom and dad weren't always right, I want you to stop paying attention to that little voice in the back of your head of mom saying, don't do this, or dad saying, do this. What would happen to society if you had a bunch of kids who stopped paying attention to the voice of the parents that they've got ingrained in the back of their brains? It'd get really ugly really quick, right? And we even see this in today's society. You've got rebellion. When you have a society full of rebellious kids who pay no attention to mom and dad, things get pretty ugly pretty quick, right? And so your conscience it's that moral compass in your mind that will cry out to you and say, hey, that's wrong, don't do it. Or, hey, that's good, you need to do it. And you have to pay attention to that. Now, everybody's got that in their mind. And so in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, Paul really dealt with that particular issue, that if you have brethren and they're disagreeing over an issue. Now, in this particular circumstance, the issue is meat sacrificed to idols. And one guy says, all that meat, you've got just you go down to the meat market and let's just say about a third of it, because that's probably about what it was. About a third of the meat that you found in the meat market that's being sold there had first been brought to an idol's temple, sacrificed to an idol, and then brought down to the meat market to be sold. So about a third of that meat there is idol meat. So you go down there and you have one brother and he says, don't worry about it. It's no big deal. I'm not worshiping Zeus. And I know Zeus is just a gold statue anyways, so I'll just go and get whatever meat I want. He goes down to the butcher, picks up whatever he wants, doesn't ask any questions. He's got a clear conscience, right? That guy's got no problems. So, and on top of it, he's right. In other words, from a knowledge standpoint, is his moral compass correct in that case? He's right on the issue, and his conscience is clear. So now you say, that's the truth, is you can just go down there and get whatever you want. But you have another brother, and he goes down to the meat market, and all he can think about is, I might be eating idol meat. I might be eating something that was sacrificed to Zeus. And that's going to bother him. I mean, if that's the way you think of the meat, as it's being something that is idolatrous, it should bother you, shouldn't it? If I think that meat has something to do with idols, it should bother me when I go look in the meat market. And so that guy looks at it, and you have two choices at that point. You can tell that guy, well, I don't care what your conscience says, eat it anyways, and what are you going to do to him? You're causing him to sin, because anything that's not done in faith is sin. That's what Romans 14 says on the subject. And on top of it, you're teaching him a really bad idea, which is, don't pay attention to your conscience. Just do what I say. Don't pay attention to your conscience. And so that's a real problem. So you can do that, or you can say, look, if you can't do it in faith, don't do it. And you just tell him to walk away. Well, that's what Paul says. And his whole point in 1 Corinthians chapter 8 is, concerning things offered to idols, we know that we all have knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but love edifies. I could sit there and look at the brother who says he has to be a vegetarian, and I say, I know better, I'm smart, you're dumb, pay attention to me. And when I've done that, my knowledge has puffed me up, hasn't it? It's made me proud, it's made me arrogant, and I've not really done him any good. Or I could show love. Love edifies, love builds up. And I could say, look, if you want to sit down and study on this, let's do it. But until you can feel good about it, let's just leave the meat market and let's go have broccoli. And so that's his point, is that knowledge, yeah, even though you have the knowledge of what the truth is on the subject, if you treat your brother in a way that forces him to do something his conscience can't handle, you are harming him. You are doing him a disservice. And eventually, you want to take that to the end result. The end result of that would be, we have a congregation full of people who pay no attention to their conscience. And that is not the kind of congregation you want. You want a congregation full of people who pay attention to that moral compass, who listen and try to do what they think is right. Now, just because they make mistakes when you try and do what's right doesn't mean you should stop trying, right? That's the whole point here is. So in 1 Corinthians 8, he goes through, and his whole point on that is conscience, conscience, conscience. You need to pay attention to your own conscience, and you need to pay attention to your brother's conscience. And he started that out with saying, well, you can go down to the meat market and eat whatever you want, so don't worry about it. But if your brother doesn't feel that way, don't force it on him. Because in truth, if he only eats broccoli for the rest of his life, is that a problem? It's not a big deal. But if he goes over there and starts eating meat when he thinks it's idolatrous, then you will cause a problem. So don't bother him with it. Don't force his conscience to do something it shouldn't feel comfortable doing. Don't worry about your own conscience. That's not a big deal. And so he said, here's my advice on the meat sacrificed to idols. Now, he's going to give more advice on it, but this is his initial advice. When you go to the meat market, just get whatever you want. But don't think that that means you can walk into an idol's temple, because this is the other option. You can get idol meat that has been sacrificed to idols. You could get it at the meat market, or you could go over to Zeus's temple, and there will be a feast there pretty much every day of the week. Don't go into that temple and take meat there. Don't ever do that. You say, well, why? Why can't I do that? I know the meat's nothing, and I know an idol is nothing. Well, what's it going to look like when you go into Zeus's temple and have a T-bone steak? It's going to look like you're worshiping Zeus. Exactly. You're going to look like an idolater, and everybody's going to think that, and you're going to harm their conscience. So I need to not only think about my own conscience, but I also need to think about my brother's. And the problem is it's a lot easier to think about mine than it is to think about his. Because mine is there in my head all the time. And then it's that voice. It's always telling you, do this, don't do that. Making you feel good when you do the right thing, making you feel bad when you do the wrong thing. And it's a constant magnetic pull on you. But you don't hear the voice in your brother's head. You just see him doing something he doesn't need to do. You see him eating broccoli and hating every moment of it, and you say, come on. When in truth, he's going through a very important process when he does that. See, he's going through that internal struggle and battle just like you do every time your conscience bothers you. And so he needs to go through that. And so Paul says, you need not only think about your conscience, you also need to think about your brother's conscience. Now, does anybody have any questions on that? Okay, so the end result is really you need to bend over backwards for those who don't have knowledge, for the weak brother. Those who haven't learned the details of this subject, you need to bend over backwards for them. I guess you could compare this to a lot of different things. One of the examples I used was the Christmas tree, and you say, well, I know that putting up a Christmas tree in my house, there's nothing wrong with that. I have no problem with that whatsoever. I'll put one up, put ornaments on the thing, no big deal. It's not a spiritual thing. It's just a pretty thing, and it's got the ornaments on it and got the lights, and that's all it is. I have no problem with that. But if there's another brother who does, and he says, oh no, that's pagan worship, should I tell him to put a Christmas tree up? No. Matter of fact, I probably shouldn't even subject him to dealing with my Christmas tree, should I? If I'm going to invite him over, I should either put it away or maybe just not invite him over during that time of year, right? Well, after I used that example, somebody came up and they asked me, they said, well, how far do we take that, Scott? Because it is a good point. You know, there's always somebody who has a problem with something, right? There are brethren who think it's a sin to have a television. So do I have to get rid of my television because some people are going to think it's a sin? Or my Christmas tree, or my internet subscription, or you have somebody who is a soldier and other people think it's a sin for a Christian to be a soldier. In other words, how far do we take this thing? Well, Paul really doesn't deal with that particular side of it, the side of the weaker conscience looking at the person who's okay with doing it. He doesn't deal with that in 1 Corinthians. He does deal with it over in Romans 14. So let's just take a look at that real quick before we move on to chapter 9, because it is a valid point. How much do I have to... Does the weaker brother have any responsibility to the knowledgeable brother? Or does he have some responsibility to just say, hey, look, I don't think a Christmas tree is right, but if you're going to have it in your house, I need to let it go? Well, if you look over at Romans 14, he says in verse 3, let's just start up in verse 1. Receive one who is weak in the faith, but not to dispute over doubtful things. In other words, you have a brother who he says, I can only eat vegetables. Receive him, accept him, but not for beating him up. Not so that you can just argue with him over and show him how stupid he is. He says, "For one believes he may eat all things, but he who is weak eats only vegetables. Let not him who eats," that is the stronger brother. Now, stronger isn't better. It's just he thinks in this issue he can. "Let not him who eats, let not him who thinks he can despise him who can't," or thinks he can't. "And let not him who thinks he can't judge him who thinks he can. For God has received him. Who are you to judge another servant? To his own master he stands or falls. Indeed, he will be made to stand, for God is able to make him stand." Point over in Romans 14 is, when you have two brethren and they disagree over an issue, and they're both bringing up Bible reasons. In other words, sometimes you have two people disagree, and one guy says, "Well, I just feel this way," and the other guy says, "Well, look, here's the Scripture," and that guy goes, "I don't care what the Scriptures say." That's not the kind of situation we're dealing with here. We're dealing with a situation where one brother says, "I think it's wrong," and he brings up some verses. Another brother says, "I think it's right," and he brings up some verses. So they're disputing, but they're both trying to do what God says. Does that make sense? In the case of the meat sacrificed to idols, the guy who ate the meat says, "I think I can because here's the Scriptures that there is no such thing as an idol." And the guy who says he thinks he can't says, "I won't do it because God says flee from idolatry." So they're both dealing with Scriptures. In that case, he says, receive one another, not just to bash heads over the thing, and don't judge the other one. The strong brother shouldn't look at the weak brother and say, "Look, you are messed up, and I should try and force you to do the wrong thing." Now, that's what Paul deals with in 1 Corinthians 8. But in Romans 14, he says the weak brother needs to also say, "Look, you're not forcing me to do it myself." You go to the Christmas tree example. If I have a Christmas tree in my house, am I forcing anybody else to put one up? No, absolutely not. If I have television in my house, am I forcing anybody else to have television in their house? Absolutely not. And so he says the guy who says he can't have a Christmas tree shouldn't despise the guy who thinks he can, because they're both following the same master. Now, it's different if the guy who thinks he can't have a Christmas tree brings one over and says, "I'm going to set it up in your living room whether you like it or not." Now, that's a different thing, isn't it? But as long as they're not forcing it upon each other, there's no reason they can't dwell in harmony and show respect for each other. Do you see how that is? Now, the Christmas tree example doesn't seem like much because most brethren don't fight over that anymore, but some brethren do. But let's take it one step farther. Let's say the soldier. Now, you have one guy over here and he says, "I think it's a sin to be a soldier because you might have to kill people, and killing people, I don't think that's something any Christian can do." And that'll be their standpoint. Now, you have one brother, the other brother over here, and he says, "I think it's okay to be a soldier," and he becomes one. So he joins the military. Now, we got a real problem, don't we? Do you see how the tension's a lot bigger in that scenario? Because every time I run into Steve, all I can think about is Steve was in the military. That's all I can think about. And so I get worked up over here that Steve was in the military and he was sinning, and he's not telling people not to, and I get all worked up in my mind over the whole thing. But the same principles still do apply. Just because Steve was in the military, does that mean I have to join it? He's not forcing it on me. Now, I have to accept that he studied his Bible and came up and said, "No, I think it's okay." And he has to accept that this other brother over here says, "No, I don't think I can. It would be wrong." They have to both accept each other's positions, but they can still dwell in harmony on the thing. And so, whenever you're dealing with conscience, the only time that you're going to have to talk about making a change in your life is when doing it would force it on somebody. Now, let me give you one example of that. There was one congregation I attended with and preached at, and there was a brother there. He joined us. I'd been there a couple of months, and then he moved into town. And this particular brother thought it was perfectly fine to have instrumental music. Now, I thought, and I still think, and I know he's dead wrong on that issue. Just 100% dead wrong. You can't. It's wrong. It's a sin. You're adding something to God's Word. But he thought you could. He had no problem with it whatsoever. Now, he came in and he told me about that, but he also said, look, Scott, I'm not ever going to ask this congregation to do it, and I'm never going to teach it from the pulpit. It's not something I'm going to force on the congregation. I am more than happy to sit here in the congregation and be like everybody else and sing without instrument. Well, can I dwell in unity with that guy? I can. There's no reason I can't. Now, do I think he's wrong? Yeah. As a matter of fact, I don't just think I know he's wrong. I mean, I'll just take it that far. I know he's wrong on that issue. But has he done any... In other words, he says, I'm the stronger brother. In that case, he's the stronger and I'm the weaker, isn't he? He's the stronger brother, says, I could, in all clear conscience, bring a piano in tomorrow and play it. I'm the weaker brother, and I'm saying, no, you couldn't do it. Now, remember how I told you stronger and weaker doesn't mean good and bad? In this case, I'm the weaker brother, but does that make me a bad Christian? No, matter of fact, I think it's because I'm a more knowledgeable Christian. So, here he is, the stronger brother, and he said, in this case, I won't ever make a big deal out of it, because if he said, I'm going to bring a piano in, then it would be forcing something on other people's conscience. It's not the same thing as having a Christmas tree in your own house, right? Because now we're talking about the public worship service, and everybody has to get along in that situation, right? And so the whole thing with conscience is you have to be thinking, is this a situation where it's forcing it upon somebody else? And so if you have a Christmas tree and it's just in your house, you're not forcing it on anybody. If you become a soldier, you're not forcing it on anybody. But the moment I say, I'm going to take that Christmas tree and put it in your house, or I'm going to wait till you're gone and decorate your whole house with Christmas lights, well, then I'm forcing it on you. Does that make sense? Now I'm putting you in a position where your conscience would be offended. Just like if that brother had said, hey, Scott, we're bringing a piano in tomorrow, and we're just going to all worship with that because I think we can. Well, no. Now you're going to offend my conscience. And so you have to have respect for each other. And that's really what it comes down to, is respect that you're both working out your own salvation with fear and trembling, and you're trying to do what God says. Anybody have any questions on that? Okay, well then let's move down to chapter 9. So 1 Corinthians chapter 9, Paul's going to continue dealing with this and dealing with freedom. Because really, when you have a brother who says, I can eat meat in the meat market, he's really talking about his freedom, isn't he? He's saying, don't tell me what to do. I have the freedom to do that. See, that's the problem is when you have two brethren and one says I can and the other says I can't, the guy who says I can, he gets real upset because he says, you're infringing on my freedom. You're telling me what I can and can't do. And especially in America, that's a big deal. We don't like to be told what to do. And so in chapter 9, he's going to address that attitude of freedom. Because whenever you start to get upset that somebody's taking your freedom away, you tend to react fairly strongly. And so Paul's going to talk about freedom and about really his freedom. So he says in chapter 9, he says, am I not an apostle? Am I not free? Have I not seen Jesus Christ our Lord? Are you not my work in the Lord? In other words, that's just a fancy way of saying, am I not important? In terms of the church, how important was Paul? He says, I'm an apostle. I'm one of the big guys. Now, this doesn't sound like the way Paul normally talks, because Paul doesn't normally talk about being some big, tough, strong guy. So what he's doing here is making a point. He says, am I not apostle? Am I not free? Have I not seen Jesus Christ? In other words, we're talking about Jesus. I saw him. I saw him in a vision. He came to me on that road to Damascus. Are you not my work in the Lord? Who started this congregation anyways? Paul talking to Corinthians, who started that church? He says, I started it. I'm an apostle. I'm a free man. I saw Jesus and Jesus Christ. And he says, if I'm not an apostle to others, yet doubtless I am to you. In other words, even if other people don't think I'm that big of a deal, I am to you. I started this congregation. For you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. You're my certificate. You're my proof. I guess it'd be the way he'd put it. He said, look, if I want to prove I'm an apostle, I point out Corinth. I point out one of these churches that I started, that I was the first guy to preach there. And so he says, you are my seal. You Gentiles who converted, you are proof that I'm an apostle. And he says, my defense to those who examine me is this: do we not have a right to eat and drink? Do we not have a right to take along a believing wife, as do also the other apostles, the brothers of the Lord, and Cephas, that is Peter. Now what he's going to do now is he just got done saying, I'm really big deal. I'm important. I'm Paul. I'm an apostle. I saw Jesus. I started this congregation. Of course, he'd only say that if he had a reason, because that's not the way he normally talks. And now he's going to switch over to saying, my defense to those who examine me, those people who would get upset when I tell them they can't eat meat. Because see, now, Paul's really dealing with the stronger brother most of the time. And the reason for that is, in Corinth, what was their problem? Everybody thought they were tough and they could do as they pleased. And there was a big division because nobody did whatever was best in the best interest of everybody else. They just thought about me, 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 me. And so Paul says, my defense to those who examine me, my defense to those who would argue against what I'm teaching you, who would argue against me as a preacher of the truth is, do I not have a right to eat and drink? Now his point there is, don't I have a right to do as I please? Don't I have a right to be paid wages so that I can eat food and drink and enjoy life? Don't I have a right to take along a believing wife, as do also the other apostles, the brothers of the Lord and Peter? His point here is, Paul spent his whole life as a single man. And that's a hard life. He had nobody to take care of him, did he? He had no helpmeet. You know, go back to Genesis. Why did God make woman? It says they could complete each other. She was his other half. She was his helper, his helpmeet. Paul says, don't I have a right to have a helpmeet? And you think about that for a second. It's kind of a little bit of an insight into Paul, that Paul did give something up, didn't he, in staying single. Now, he told you in chapter 7 why he did that. Why did he do it? Why was he single his whole life? Remember, it was in chapter 7, he was talking about marriage, and he said the guy who is single, he has the freedom to do something. And remember, it was the freedom to do the Lord's work. He's not hindered by anything else. He doesn't have to worry about the concerns of his wife. All he has to do is focus on serving the Lord and pleasing Him. So Paul says, don't I have a right to have a wife? The other apostles do. Peter does. Or is only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working? In other words, are Barnabas and I the only guys who have no right to relax? Whoever goes to war at his own expense. When was the last time there was a soldier who paid his own way to be a soldier? No, you always pay him. You always pay a soldier to fight. Who plants a vineyard and doesn't eat the fruit of it? Why on earth would anybody ever plant a vineyard and not eat the fruit? That'd be about the dumbest thing you'd ever saw, right? Who tends a flock and doesn't drink the milk of the flock? You never see an example of that. Do I say these things as a mere man, or does not the law say the same also? It is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain. Is it oxen God is concerned about? Now what he points out here is, I'm not just telling you something that I think is a good idea. I've got Scripture to back it up. Now what he's pointing out here is a whole bunch of freedoms he doesn't have anymore, right? Do you notice that? He's saying, I gave up the freedom to relax. I gave up the freedom to have a wife. I gave up the freedom to be paid for my services. And he says, and I have that freedom, and I've got Scripture to back it up. In the Old Testament, it says, you shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain. Now, the point of that is, when you have an ox and he's turning that millstone, and he's turning it and turning it and turning it, and all that grain is being ground up, and he turns the thing, and there's grain on the floor, do you muzzle the oxen so he can't eat any of that grain? No, you let him, he's taking and treading all the grain out. If he wants to reach his mouth down and get a little bite of it, you let him. That's his point. He says even in the Old Testament it said that don't be cruel to animals. I guess there's something in the Bible for everybody, even PETA. And so it just let the animals, while it's working, you let it reach down and get a little mouthful. There's nothing wrong with that. And he says, did he write that for the sake of oxen? So no, he wrote that to teach you a lesson that if somebody's working, they should get a little mouthful of what they worked for. If they're tending a vineyard, they should be able to eat the fruit of it. And if a soldier's going to war and he's putting his life on the line, the least you can do is give him a hot meal. You see that point? And so he says, here's the scripture on it. Even in law of Moses it said that a worker's worth is higher. Verse 10, does he say it altogether for our sakes? For our sakes, no doubt, this is written that he who plows should plow in hope. And he who threshes in hope should be partaker of his hope. If you have a man who's plowing, and he's plowing a field, is there anything to eat when you're plowing? I mean, is there anything to eat in the field when you're plowing? No, there's nothing there yet. So why do you plow? Why does a man get out there and plow the ground up? Yeah, prepare it for seed. He's thinking, I'm going to plant seed in this, and that seed's going to grow, and someday I'm going to have something to eat. He plows in hope, right? How about he who threshes? It says he who threshes in hope should be partaker of his hope. You have a man out there, and he's threshing the wheat. He's getting that chaff and that wheat and separating it, and that's a lot of hard work. And he's out there, and that grain's falling to the ground, and the chaff's blowing away, and he's looking at the grain in hope. He thinks, when this work's done, I'm going to have some grain to eat. Does that make sense? Every farmer works in hope. And his point here is, I have been preaching really with no hope. And that's his point. I have no helper. I've been working. Remember when he went to Corinth, he was a tent maker there. He paid his own ways. I was working and preaching, and I never got paid for it. Never supported. I never relaxed. I never stopped. And so here he says, verse 11, if we have sown spiritual things for you, is it a great thing if we reap your material things? Wouldn't it be only fair after we gave you spiritual food that you pay for us to have physical food? Now, everything he's saying comes down to, but you didn't. Okay? Wouldn't it be right if Paul had been paid to preach, but I wasn't? Wouldn't it be right if I sowed the seed of God and changed lives and got people the knowledge that would get them to heaven, that at the very least I'd be able to relax once in a while? But I can't. And so everything he's saying, I should have this freedom. I should at least be able to enjoy, after preaching to people, the blessings of marriage and the wonders of God making men and women and how wonderful a thing it can be in this life to have a helpmeet. You'd think the very least I could have would be a helpmeet myself. But I don't. So his whole point is, I haven't partaken of any of this. I haven't used my freedom. Remember I told you this chapter is about freedom? I should do this. I have the right to get this, but I never did. If others are partakers of this right over you, are we not even more? Nevertheless, we have not used this right, but endure all things lest we hinder the gospel of Christ. So Paul says, I have the right to get money from you. I have the right to relax. I have the right to say, hey, I'm an apostle, pay attention to me. But I never did that. I never used that right. He said, now, why didn't I ever use it? Because I didn't want to hinder the gospel. And so here's Paul, and he's just in chapter 8, he just finished up dealing with, you need to sometimes take a hit for the brethren. Just say, look, I feel like I have a right to, but I'm not going to, because it benefits other people. And so he now deals with the people who say, but are you telling me I don't have freedom? You're going to take my freedom away? And Paul says, let me talk to you about freedom for a second. I have all these rights, and I never took them. Why? Because the gospel's more important than me. Do you see how he builds that up? He's just building it one thing after another so that he can say the gospel's more important. I didn't want the gospel to be hindered. That's why I worked as a tent maker. That's why I don't have a wife. That's why I don't relax. Because the gospel is more important than me, and so I don't take my freedoms. That makes sense? Anybody have any questions on that? Okay, so he lays that out. So if Paul won't take his rights, it doesn't sound like it's very fair for me over here to say, well, that's not fair. I should be able to have a T-bone steak. Do you see how that makes it kind of petty? Makes it petty when all of a sudden I start throwing a temper tantrum because I have to do something to help somebody else out, and I have to bear with their conscience. His whole point is, let's not be petty here for a second. It's not like I'm telling you to do something I don't do 1,000 times more. And so he says down in verse 13, do you not know that those who minister the holy things eat of the things of the temple? Those who serve at the altar partake of the offerings of the altar. Now if you go back to the Old Testament, when the priests made all those burnt offerings, if you read in the Old Testament, there was always a portion they got to take home. So somebody would make an offering to God, and they'd bring it to the priest and they'd say, I want to make this offering, and the priest would take it and he'd offer it, but then he'd cut part of it off, and he could take that home to feed his family. So those who minister the offerings get to partake of the offerings. So this is just another way of saying a worker's worth is higher. It's another way of saying, hey, I have a right to partake of that which I'm serving in. So even so, the Lord has commanded those who preach the gospel should live from the gospel. For guys like me, that's a great verse to underline. Because that's how I make sure my family gets fed. If that verse weren't in there, if Paul didn't talk about these things, it would be wrong to pay a preacher. Matter of fact, there are religions that take verses like this out. Well, you take Mormonism, for example, and they think it's wrong for a preacher to be paid. And so here, my point really, if you look at verse 14, is Paul's a better man than me. That's really what it comes down to, because Paul said, I had a right to be paid to preach, and I didn't take that right. And here's Scott Beyer, and he says, I have a right to be paid to preach, and thank you very much. You see what he's saying here is, Paul had that right. Would it have been wrong for Paul to take money? No, it would have been perfectly fine for him to take money. Nothing wrong with it whatsoever. Honorable. Just as honorable as a man going out and working in a vineyard and eating of the grapes of it. Totally appropriate. Nobody gets upset with that. It'd be just like anybody else going to work and then they get the paycheck at the end of the day. That doesn't make them rude or mean or anything for taking a paycheck, does it? They worked for it. They earned it. That's what Paul says. So it says, I earned that pay when I preached to you, and I never took it. I never took my freedom. He says, verse 15, I have used none of these things, nor have I written these things that it should be done so to me. Now he stops here for a second. He says, now I didn't take those things, and I'm not writing to it now, so you'll all write me a check and send it in the mail so that I'll get it later. I'm not asking for money. I don't want those things now even. I didn't take those things, for it would be better for me to die than anyone should make my boasting void. He says, I'm boasting for a purpose. And if you all started paying me, imagine all of a sudden the Corinthians, they got out of this, oh, Paul wants money, and they sent him a bunch of money. He says, then you'd waste the point of my boasting. I'm boasting here for a reason. My boasting, he says, verse 16, if I preach the gospel, I have nothing to boast of, for necessity is laid upon me. Yes, woe is me if I do not preach the gospel. For if I do this willingly, I have a reward. But if against my will, I have been entrusted with a stewardship. So here's Paul's point. He says, I never wanted money, and the reason for it is God gave me a job. He says, my job was to preach the gospel. And he says, the Lord has laid that on me to preach the gospel, and to do it in what way? What was unique about the way Paul preached the gospel? He just got done talking about it. He did it in one way that nobody else did. He did it for free. That's all it was. He just did it for free. He didn't take paycheck. He says, it's been laid on me to do that. It's the Lord's will that I do that. And he says, that's my job. I've been entrusted with a stewardship. He says, and if I do it willingly, I'll get a reward. Now, the reward's not money. The reward is, he's going to talk about the reward is the blessing of knowing that he's done something worthwhile. He says, but if I don't do it willingly, well, I'm still a servant and I got to do what I got to do. Right? And I guess it's just like when you go to work and you go to work and your boss tells you to do something you don't want to do, you can either put a smile on your face and work and do it, and you'll get a reward then. That reward will be your boss says, boy, I know nobody likes to do that job, but I was impressed. You did it and you had a cheerful attitude. But if you have a bad attitude, guess what? You still got to do the job. That's his point. You still got to take care of it. It doesn't matter whether you like to or not. And so he says, what is my reward then? He says, if I do it willingly, I have a reward. If I preach for free willingly, I've got a reward. And that reward is that when I preach the gospel, I may present the gospel of Christ without charge, that I may not abuse my authority in the gospel. Paul says his great joy in willingly preaching for free was he was doing something really nobody else did, which was he was presenting the gospel and just totally free. It didn't cost anybody anything. He'd just go around preaching it, and it didn't cost the church there anything to support him. And so he could see them, and they could grow and be involved and work, and that money could go to other things. And so he says, that's my joy, is that when I give up my freedom, I get the joy of seeing you benefit from it. Do you see how that works? Think about it. It's just the same as anything else. You know, when you take time to raise your kids, you know, you've got your kids and they want your time every 2 seconds, right? Doesn't a parent have a right to say, look, just leave me alone? Just leave me alone and give me some relaxation for a moment. Doesn't an adult have a right to do that? Sure they do. And yet, when you as a parent say, all I want to do is be left alone for a second, but you take a deep breath and you go and help little Johnny, what's your reward? Reward isn't your relaxation. You didn't get that. You gave that up. Your reward is they benefit from it, right? You know, when somebody else has a problem and you go and you drive and you take like, in the church, you know, when somebody's moving, right? And somebody's moving, we're going to have a moving party. And my favorite moving parties are the moving parties where you show up and there's nothing in a box. You know, ever done one of those? You know, you just show up and it's just a mess. And you show up, you would have every right to say, look, I'm leaving. This is your problem. Wouldn't you have a right to say that if somebody invites you over to move them and you just... And yet, I can't tell you how many times I've seen brethren, they show up, place is just a mess, nothing's boxed up, and I've seen brethren where they go, they buy the boxes. They come back, they pack everything in the boxes. And they help the person move anyways. Now, they had every right to say, see ya. This is your problem, not mine. But they gave up, they sacrificed that right, and what was their reward? How do you think the person felt at the end? Oh, wow. Oh, you guys are wonderful. They got the reward of helping somebody else. That's Paul's point in freedom. When I give up my freedom, my conscience says I have every right to eat, but I give it up for my brother's conscience. I've sacrificed something, but I do get a reward. That reward is I helped him. And that's something we have to remember in Christianity, because Christianity, a lot of it is about sacrifice, isn't it? What would the church be if you had a bunch of people who said, I'm never sacrificing anything for anybody? It'd just be a mess, wouldn't it? You wouldn't even want to be a part. Why would you be a part? You'd have no teamwork. And so Paul's point is that sacrifice that we do in other areas of our life for the gospel also is involved in this area too. When you see somebody who's learning and growing and you say, why are they so dumb? Why is this such a big deal to them? They should know better than this. Well, take a deep breath and you step back and you act in a brotherly fashion anyways. That's making a sacrifice for the benefit of others, just like Paul preaching for free. If you think about how much money Paul gave away over his years of preaching, because when he doesn't take pay that was rightly deserved, that's like giving it away, isn't it? How much money did he give away? It's just an unbelievable amount, isn't it? I mean, it is almost scary to think about all the churches that owed him a great deal of money. He said, well, what's my reward? My reward is that I didn't hinder the gospel, that I was able to preach it for free, and I could write that down to my account. So when we say, instead of stomping our feet like little kids and say, I have a right, why would you, why do I have to stop doing stuff just because some other brother's got a problem with it? When instead of doing that, we act mature and like adults and we make those sacrifices, I get a reward. I've stored up treasures for myself in heaven. I've done something for their benefit. Anybody have any questions on that? Okay. And so here Paul says, down in verse 19, he sums his whole attitude up on freedom in saying, for though I am free from all men, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win the more. In other words, I have total freedom. I can do as I please, but I'll serve everybody. I serve everybody that I might win people to Christ. To the Jews, I became as a Jew, that I might win Jews. Now think about this for a second. Here's Paul, and when Paul's preaching to Jews, how many rules about how you dress, how you eat, how you talk did Jews have? Well, you got a whole Old Testament of them, first of all. And then on top of it, you have to add all the ones the Pharisees had added on to it, all their traditions and garbage. So, can you imagine how frustrating that must have been for Paul? That when he's preaching to Jews, he had to not do this and not do that, even though he knew full well that those are all just silly rules that didn't apply. Can you see how frustrating that would be? And so, here it is. Paul says, I became like a Jew that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law is under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. Now, Paul gives a great example of this back in the book of Acts. When he came into Jerusalem, there was a bunch of Christians, and they were worried that Paul's reputation would be that he was a Gentile lover and a Jew hater. And so when he came to Jerusalem, the elders at the church there said, Paul, what we'd like you to do is there's a couple of guys who'd made Jewish vows. So what we want you to do is we want you to pay for them to go to the temple and to finish up their vows. Now I want you to think about that for a second. It's not wrong for Paul to do that. But was that a religious act for him to pay temple vow money? Not for Paul. Paul knew, where was the temple now? Did the Jewish temple matter anymore? Not at that point. Where was the real temple? Paul preaches on it. He says the church is the temple. The body is the temple. So here's this temple, and they're going to bring money into that. And Paul paid to put money into the Jewish temple because there were some brethren who still felt like they were under the law, and Paul wanted to make sure that he didn't upset them. Now, talk about really just biting your tongue. I mean, and so here Paul, he says, to those who are under the law is under the law. He says, I just don't even want to deal with that. I don't want people to start getting upset about things like that. So I'm not going to worry about it so that I can win those who are under the law. To those who are without law as without law, not being without law toward God, but under law toward Christ. Now here's Paul. He starts preaching to the Gentiles. And Gentiles ate all sorts of things that were just absolutely disgusting to a Jew. And no matter what, Paul had been raised a Jew, right? So Paul, he knew you could eat bacon. He knew you could eat all these things. But it's going to be repulsive to him, wouldn't it? I mean, can you think about it? I mean, they did all sorts of things like they would eat the intestines of animals, and they would eat... they would take one of the great delicacies is they'd take the teats off of a pig and they'd lop them off and they'd fill them with like a custard, and then you'd eat that. That doesn't sound enjoyable to me even, and I don't even have the problems Paul had. So now here it is, Paul sits down with Gentiles. He's going to have a meal with Gentiles and he's going to talk to them about the gospel, and they set that in front of him. What's every Jewish bone in his body going to want to do? It's disgusting. And yet, what did Paul do? He says, to those who are without the law, I acted without the law. He says, I ate it. That's what he did. He said, I ate it. I didn't worry about it. Now, that's important because there's a lot of things that we do in life that you say, I wouldn't want to do that. But if it's going to benefit the gospel, just get your hands dirty. Right? There's a lot of tasks that we have being Christians that are repulsive to us, not what we'd want to do, and yet if it'll benefit the gospel, we do it. And that's Paul's point. He says, to the weak I became as weak that I might win the weak. Now, was Paul a real weak guy? Is he the kind of person you'd think of as weak? Kind of, real mild and shy type. That's Paul, right? He's everything but, right? Paul was strong and convicted, and so Paul would sit down with somebody who just kind of, just get scared about this and scared about that, and they weren't confident, and they worry a lot. Boy, that's about as different from Paul's personality as you could possibly get, isn't it? And yet Paul says, when I sat down with them, I didn't just hammer them. He says, to the weak I became weak. I said, boy, I can understand how you'd be worried about that. I worry about things sometimes too. Of course, Paul, what would be the things Paul worry about? Paul worry about the sake of the gospel in the world. And they're worried about whether the laundry will get done. And yet Paul would be weak with the weak. And so he'd pull alongside them. And so it's that lesson to us that really what is real maturity in Christ? It isn't, I have the freedom, nobody has the right to tell me what to do. That's not maturity. Maturity is, I will do whatever it takes to serve Christ. And that's exactly what Christ said, isn't it? He said, the first shall be last and the last shall be first. Those who are going to be first among you will be servant of all. And that's his point. I have become all things to all men that I might by all means save some. Did Paul think by doing this he'd save everybody? No, he says save some. So you mean to tell me there were times where Paul made those sacrifices and he gave things up and he got burnt anyways? And things turned out bad and people mistreated him even though he went out of his way to help them? Yeah. Matter of fact, that happened probably quite a lot. So, and so much so that, we have a saying as human beings that no good deed goes unpunished, right? So here it is. Paul says, I do this stuff, and sometimes people just mock you for it. And I go out of my way to be helpful to people, and sometimes people make fun of you for it, or act like you're less of a man for it. Matter of fact, that's one of the things he'll deal with over in 2 Corinthians, is he deals with the fact that there were certain people who thought because Paul didn't take pay, he wasn't a real preacher. And so here it was, Paul went out of his way to be kind and to preach for free, and some people stabbed him in the back with it. And so when you make those sacrifices, it'll turn out sour sometimes, but that doesn't mean you stop making them. Because people who make those kind of sacrifices and people who give and people who help and people who go that extra mile, they're the ones who save some. If I don't do those things, I won't get hurt. But how many people am I going to save? It says, yeah, I'll save none then. If you never take that risk of making sacrifices to help others and putting others before yourself and giving up your freedoms, then you'll never have a chance of making a difference. So verse 23 says, I do this for the gospel's sake, that I may be partaker of it with you. Do you not know that those who run in a race all run, but one receives the prize? Now here it is, you get a race, everybody runs, but some people come up empty-handed, don't they? It says only one guy gets the prize, the guy who runs the hardest, the fastest, the longest. And Paul says, run in such a way that you may obtain it. So when do I give up making sacrifices? When do I stop working hard? When do I give my 45% versus my 100%? It says run in such a way as you want to win that prize. Guys who want to win the prize in a running race give their best 100% of the time. So don't grow weary of doing good. And it says everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things. That word temperate means self-controlled. He's been talking about freedom here, and he was saying in the case of somebody else's conscience, yeah, you have freedom, but you need to sacrifice that freedom for the sake of your brother. Show some self-control. If you compete for a prize, you show self-control. You show discipline. They do it to obtain a perishable crown, but we an imperishable crown. When the Romans ran their Olympic races, they would take and they would weave a crown for the winner. And it'd be woven out of olive branches. And they'd take that thing and they'd put it on the guy's head. And that was one of the greatest things you could ever have, is to have that crown put on your head as an athlete. That meant you were the best of the best. It's like a gold medal in the Olympics today. And so they put that on the guy's head, and that was everything. He says, those guys show discipline. They show self-control to win a perishable crown. How much do 100-meter dash sprinters work to win the Olympic race? Every day, right? And when it's cold and wet, they work anyways. And when they're tired, they work anyways. He said, no, they show total discipline in everything, total self-control. They get out of bed when they don't feel like getting out of bed. They run that extra mile when their body's burning and telling them to stop. They run it anyways. He said, and they do it for just a silly old plant on their head. But you do it, and I do it, for an imperishable crown. Therefore, I run this not with uncertainty. I don't run just kind of back and forth and where am I going and what am I doing? I don't know. He said, I don't run like a confused man. I fight not as one who beats the air. I'm not just kind of randomly throwing my arms out there. I'm trying to hit that target. He says, I discipline my body and I bring it into subjection, lest when I have preached to others, I myself should become disqualified. I think it's really interesting that here's the Apostle Paul, and Paul said that even I could become disqualified if I stopped trying. If tomorrow I just said, I worked hard enough and I'm done, he says, I wouldn't have run the race and I too could become disqualified. And so you run it hard. You make those sacrifices. You work hard. You do everything you can for the brotherhood and for the gospel because it's worth it. Because that's what's really important. Because at the end of this life, when we're all done with this, you're going to have ultimate freedom then, aren't you? Then you really aren't going to have to worry about anything. So between now and then, we got to give it our best. And if we have to bite our tongue and help other people when they're not as knowledgeable as you, or, they have a weak conscience and you think it'd be fine and they think it won't. And just if you have to give something up and make some sacrifices for people, then do it. Churches every day divide over the fact that one group wants to do this and another group wants to do this. It's rarely over doctrine. Almost always it's some fight over roving classes or which songs are being led or who's in charge of what and who's the most liked and what guy became a deacon and just things that aren't worth it. And so people snub each other and they get angry with each other and that feeds onto their kids and then their kids' kids. And then you realize, why does everybody hate each other? Just because everybody was unwilling to give up their freedom. They were unwilling to make sacrifices for the greater good. So Paul says down there in chapter 9, make those sacrifices. Discipline yourself for the sake of the gospel that you might win some. Anybody have any questions? Yeah. Not from the Corinthians, yeah. Yeah, and he makes that point to them that, he never did. And the interesting thing is there was really only a couple congregations he ever accepted money from, and they really had to force it on him. Philippi forced it on him, and then the only other one really was Antioch when he went from there. So, yeah, it's just one of those things where, the Corinthians, he said, I could have asked, but I never did, and there's a reason for that. So, anybody else? He could. No, he could have asked. He said, Doesn't he say that he did them a disservice by not taking money from them? Well, he said at one point, he says, I'm worried that maybe I did do you a disservice. And so he never says he did actually, but he does say sometimes he wrestled with that with them because he thought, well, boy, maybe I've kept you from the opportunity to gain blessings from supporting somebody. And so, yeah, you're right. He does say that at one point where he says, I was worried. Maybe I did do you a disservice. Maybe you should have had to pay and out of your own pocket. Because that does teach maturity to a congregation. So, yeah. Any other questions? Okay, then we'll stop there. We'll pick up in chapter 10 next week.